name is Dr. Irene Mavrakakis. I'd like to preface my presentation by briefly summarizing the root of our problems. How do we discover the best information with which to guide our actions? How do we discover the best information with which to order mankind? The great Austrian economist and 1974 Nobel laureate F.A. Hayek, in some of his seminal writings like The Use of Knowledge in Society and the aptly titled Competition as a Discovery Procedure, helped us realize that economic competition is how we discover and spread superior information throughout society. It is the freedom of nearly 8 billion minds in their roles as consumers to freely trade their private property for what they calculate to be the best, which motivates companies to innovate and copy each other's innovations, information, and ideas, thus inadvertently turning the entire planet into a global supercomputer via the system of competitive knowledge and discovery. For example, an engineer working for Honda in Tokyo discovers superior information by inventing power door locks. The freedom of customers to freely trade their wealth for the Honda power door locks motivates BMW, Ford, Toyota, and all the other competitors to copy the power door locks ideas, thus spreading superior information and subsequent order throughout society. Just like in the Olympics, we can discover the best athletes in the world due to global competition, so does having the freedom to trade with everyone in the world allow us to have the best ideas to compete and spread globally, thus ensuring the best possible global order. Via advertising, competitors are motivated to spread the potential usefulness and superiority of their products and ideas, and as well as pointing out the defects, inferiority of their competitors, thus accelerating the need to compete, copy, spread superior information and subsequent order. As cost-cutting ideas emerge and inevitably spread via competition, leading relative prices to continuously fall, new profitable ideas easily arise and once again spread via competition in an endless cycle of knowledge generation and innovation. For example, computers were once very expensive, but once the price of making them came down enough, people easily realized that everyone should have one and could have one. That gave birth to a computerized world and the internet and all the great things that flow from it. The more wealth is produced, the more wealth must be offered in exchange for labor as companies compete against each other by offering higher wages for the labor they need, which helps explain why the economic pie grows for everyone. Government or public sector orders lack incentives to innovate or copy existing innovations, since the wealth that sustains them comes from taxes and not by acting based on information superior to competitors. Government regulations are coercive, competition-less monopoly information, which is not subject to continuous replacement via competition, so they paralyze entire industries, slowing competitive knowledge discovery, driving up costs, more lawyers, regulators, bureaucrats, and making criminals out of people who harm no one, but just prefer to do things differently. As this image above helps illustrate, this explains why increasingly regulated, paralyzed healthcare sector has grown from consuming 5% of the economy in 1960 to over 20% today, culminating in the current COVID mania tyranny. In this image, we can see how the same paralysis happens across all sectors, not just medicine. By comparison, the software IT sector has few regulations. There is no American Computer Programmers Association monopolizing and paralyzing the knowledge relating to software like the American Medical Association does for medicine, so free competition motivates the creation and spread of innovations. The former Soviet Union had plenty of highly educated scientists and experts who arrogantly mocked religious traditions and whose ultimately inferior central plans required the coercion of millions, as still happens in Cuba and North Korea. But they were thoroughly crushed by free Americans, their Bibles, their traditions with respected private property, and thus emergent superior competitive knowledge discovery. The classic nighttime image above helps explain the difference between competitive private free orders and monopolistic government coerced orders. Keep your eye on how information arises and spreads via competition and continuously restructures the social order. Since the Soviet Union had no competitive knowledge discovery, it quickly got many experts coursing millions in various industries. The scientific monopoly expert or great leader was Trifon Lysenko. His competition-immune ideas relating to farming led to massive famines in the USSR and later the Great Chinese Famine, which claimed over 20 million lives. Being a favorite of Stalin and also on good terms with his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, it wasn't until Khrushchev's downfall in 1963 that Lysenko was thoroughly discredited. From his wiki, we read, In 1964, physicist Andrei Sakharov spoke out against Lysenko in the General Assembly of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. He is responsible for the shameful backwardness of Soviet biology and of genetics in particular, for the dissemination of pseudoscientific views, for adventurism, for the degradation of learning, and for the defamation, firing, arrest, even death of many genuine scientists. Having our own competition-immune top-down bureaucracies like the CDC, AMA, FDA, and NIAID, we too suffer from a massive lack of innovation in medicine and evolve our own Lysenkos, with Anthony Fauci being the perfect example. I'd like to conclude this preface by highlighting the fact that what we really need is not necessarily the right answers, but the public's understanding of how freedom and resulting competitive knowledge discovery is what will provide the best means of discovering them. What follows in the rest of my presentation is just one example of how competition-immune bureaucrats neglected superior ideas as they wrecked the lives and well-being of billions. We were told that science was the reason for lockdowns, mask mandates, forced or coerced experimental vaccines, and withholding of early treatments. What science was that? Was science actually applied? As a physician and Mises Caucus libertarian, in my opinion, no. Biological and economic scientific principles were not applied by the decision makers as it relates to the handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Did we live under tyranny here in the US? And if so, at whose hand? Did we follow pseudoscience or science or both? How unscientific or scientific were the decisions made by these decision makers? Was the handling of the pandemic unconstitutional? These are massive subjects. The majority of the presentation will show the medical evidence to make the case that the handling of the coronavirus pandemic was unscientific as it relates to the natural sciences, in particular the biological sciences. With the help of Mises and Hayek, in my preface, we already discussed the ideas that give us the understanding that the handling of the coronavirus pandemic was also unscientific as it relates to the social sciences, particularly economics. Unconstitutionality will also be touched on briefly, but I will leave most of that to your own journeys and to the legal scholars. Was the handling of the coronavirus pandemic unconstitutional? The federal government should have no power over healthcare or any other public health or public safety matter, as this authority simply does not exist and was delegated to the states or the people in the 10th Amendment. Public health and public safety were not intended as federal authorities, but to be left to the states or the people. Either way, no national government should be making healthcare decisions for individuals, nor forcing policies on businesses. The CDC, which is funded partly by the CDC Foundation, which receives money from many sources, including but not limited to the nonprofit arms of the pharmaceutical industry, and is such not an agency under government control. Many problems with the entity and the authority it was given exist. It could be argued that the CDC itself is unconstitutional. It only exists and continues to grow based on Great Depression-era Supreme Court rulings, permissiveness by the states, and scare tactics. Notwithstanding the fact is, again, the CDC is partly privately funded by the industry via the CDC Foundation that served to financially benefit from vaccine mandates and the like. Additionally, the CDC extended past its authorizing regulations. The CDC's actions during COVID, notably an eviction moratorium decree, expanded any conceivable understanding of what the CDC should be able to do under current regulation. This expanded notion of what is permissible by the CDC or any federal agency during crises has many implications, chiefly growing bureaucracy and scope of authority that will be used down the road to further grow bureaucracy and scope of authority. Once we get to the biological component of the presentation, it may be the case that the issue of unconstitutionality as it relates to the handling of the coronavirus pandemic is almost, I dare say, a superfluous discussion. Why? Because the biological scientific basis for lockdowns, mask mandates, and forced or coerced vaccines and withholding of early treatments was highly faulted at best and simply wrong and unnecessary at its worst, in my opinion. The concept of informed consent and lack of its use during the pandemic is a major crux of the problems of the handling of the pandemic. The concept of informed consent as it relates to medical procedures and interventions is inherently tied to our body autonomy and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Did we retain our liberties the past 2 years? Informed consent is an important concept and is considered a requirement for the delivery of standard of care. The information provided during the process of informed consent requires the ability to fully understand the potential short and long-term consequences. Informed consent also necessitates the ability to decline without force or coercion. The ability to decline freely without fear of loss of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Did we have informed consent for the following medical interventions? Masks, vaccines, new experimental medications, forced testing, isolation. Were these interventions based on any of the sciences we discussed earlier? And if so, which ones? And if not, why not? No, we did not have informed consent. And no, these decisions were not based on science. In my opinion, yes, our civil liberties were infringed upon. Also, in my opinion. I'm a physician, and therefore the biological sciences are the science I have more knowledge in. We formed a nonpartisan group in Delaware to assess the handling of the coronavirus pandemic, and we presented these findings to the physician leaders at the governor's office and the Department of Public Health. Humanity and our immune systems have innate intelligence. Given the proper environment, humanity survives and even prospers. Similarly, given the proper environment, the immune system survives, prospers, and even heals itself. We have immune systems. The most studied supplement is also the one that has made the biggest impact on COVID severity, vitamin D. Multiple studies worldwide have shown the importance of vitamin D as it relates to illness outcomes. A study out of Israel showed that patients who had vitamin D levels below 20 nanograms per milliliter were 14 times more likely to end up hospitalized or in critical condition. A meta-analysis of 7 hospitals determined that serum levels of vitamin D above 50 nanograms per milliliter resulted in 0 deaths. There are 70 studies just on early treatment with vitamin D, and those studies found 81% reduction in severe cases, ventilation rates, and deaths. This graph says it all. The higher the levels of vitamin D, the lower the death rate. We can see that mortality significantly drops off once a person hits about 28 nanograms per milliliter. It is important to note that normal lab values do not equal optimum levels. For instance, LabCorp started using 20 as their low end of normal about a year ago. The normal values are based on a bell curve of the population being tested in the area. The more unhealthy the population, the more suboptimal the normal levels are. Vitamin D is a big one, but there are other vitamins and minerals that have a significant role in limiting viruses' abilities to overwhelm the body. Knowing the mechanisms of action of any virus gives us an opportunity to support the body nutritionally and defend against the pathogenesis of the illness. We know zinc inhibits viral replication by preventing the virus from entering the cell. Zinc also aids in oxygen transport, reducing the risk of hypoxia, something commonly seen with this virus. Vitamin C has been known for decades to have antiviral and antibacterial effects, which may decrease the likelihood that COVID progresses into the second stage of illness and organizing bacterial pneumonia. Vitamin C may play a role in preventing that complication. The hallmark that makes COVID-19 atypical are the pro-inflammatory cytokine storms and the risk of developing micro and macro blood clots. This is where quercetin comes in. Quercetin is a really interesting nutrient. When given during the first few days of symptoms, it shortens the duration of illness. This is because it is antiviral, anti-inflammatory, as well as anti-blood clotting. There are a multitude of inexpensive and easy public health interventions that could have been implemented immediately. A state-sponsored program informing the public of the benefits of nutritional supplementation, fresh air, sleep, exercise, stress management would have been a highly beneficial program for health outcomes as it relates to COVID-19 and health resiliency moving forward. There were, and there are, early treatment options. The American Journal of Medicine in January 2021 published this article with this algorithm. The protocol was the summation of contributions from physicians across the globe. It considered risk factors, relative risk, and utilized common medications, and more importantly, could be implemented without hospitalization. Unfortunately, 2 years into the pandemic, the advice still given by many primary care doctors and emergency room physicians is, come back if you get worse. The FLCCC protocol is one of the most widely known treatment protocols. Its contributors are physicians from multiple countries and specialties who have each treated not hundreds, but thousands of COVID patients with great success. During the pandemic, the protocol was edited constantly as new information became available. Drugs changed as we learned what worked best. The drugs utilized are benign, well-known medications, not new drugs with limited clinical experience. They are generally inexpensive, repurposed drugs. Dare I say off-label. If every primary care doctor and ER physician in the country had read and used this protocol, we would have saved thousands of lives. Dr. Peter McCullough was quoted as saying that as many as 85% of all COVID deaths could have been prevented with aggressive early treatment. Repurposed drugs are drugs that have been around for many years, that were used for something new. This is also known as off-label use. Many people do not understand what off-label means. Did you know that millions of Americans take an aspirin every day to prevent a heart attack are using aspirin off-label? A medication called trazodone was prescribed over 23 million times last year, often to help people sleep. And the use of this medication as a sleep aid is off-label. All off-label means is that the manufacturer had not obtained FDA approval for a specific indication at the time that the pharmaceutical company applied for FDA approval. So using an off-label drug for a new disease makes sense. This is generally not because the drug is not effective. It's because getting a clinical indication involves years of effort and millions of dollars in clinical trials. Furthermore, when something is new like COVID, there is no medication that will be FDA approved for that indication because the clinical indication did not exist before the virus came along. Thus, all medications are off-label in the beginning. From the stats on the slide, you can see that 36% of ICU medication and 47% of headache medications are used off-label. 79% of children leaving a hospital are prescribed off-label drugs. Off-label is not synonymous with unhelpful or dangerous. As far back as January 2020, Anthony Fauci was advocating for early treatment. He recognized that treating people early in the disease would speed their recovery, reduce the likelihood that they develop severe outcomes, and reduce demand on the healthcare system. In an interview, September 11, 2020, with Jennifer Gardner, he said, if you're deficient in vitamin D, that does have an impact on your susceptibility to infection. I would not mind recommending, and I do it myself, taking vitamin D supplements. Of course, this recommendation was made via a Twitter interview, and the recommendation never gained traction because it was not integrated into public messaging. Here we have a list of off-label medications that have shown value in fighting COVID. All the medications listed here have multiple trials that support their use. Some of them also have trials that discredit their use. Therefore, the discerning physician needs to evaluate the quality of the studies and their relative merit, and then make a clinical decision. If a drug is being studied for early treatment, studies that enrolled patients up to 10 days after onset of symptoms will not likely show a benefit. If a study uses low dosages or short treatment duration, it likely won't show a benefit. The problem during COVID was that a single poorly designed study was often used to discredit well-designed studies that did show efficacy. Science is supposed to be the pursuit of truth, and not all studies are of equal quality. In hindsight, rigorous and open public debate would have served America better. Unfortunately, many physicians were fearful that such a debate would jeopardize their licenses. COVID represents very little risk to children. In fact, out of the 70 million children in the US, roughly 1,400 died while COVID positive, and some fraction of those died from COVID. Most had significant pre-existing conditions. Heide Leffert published in the journal Nature in 2021, showing that COVID killed about 2 out of every million children in England. Using this metric, the risk of vaccine injury approximates or even exceeds the risk of disease injury. The problem, frankly, is errors in reporting. Just a few months ago, the CDC removed over 400 childhood deaths, a full 24% of the total, from the statistics due to coding error. With swings like this, it's hard to make concrete analytical claims. Further, we are observing that the efficacy of the vaccines is shrinking with each subsequent variant, and the vaccines are not leaving our bodies in 2 to 3 days as previously asserted by officials. Roken et al. March 22 published in the journal Cell that biopsies of lymph nodes showed both spike proteins and mRNA from the vaccines in the germinal centers of lymph nodes at 60 days after vaccination. We have no idea what the long-term implication of the mRNA presence will be in children. With this new data, we should be taking a step back and reevaluating our policy with regard to childhood vaccination. One of the arguments for vaccinating children is to help protect the elderly. This argument, however, lacks merit. The vaccines clearly have some measurable risk based on side effect data. But the risk of a child with no comorbidities dying from COVID is virtually zero. So the risk-benefit ratio does not clearly favor vaccination. This notion was asserted by clinicians at the FDA vaccine approval hearings here in the US and is not a novel argument. Many countries around the world continue to not recommend COVID vaccination for young children. Further, now that Dr. Walensky has publicly stated that vaccines can no longer prevent transmission or infection, vaccinating children cannot logically protect the elderly. The AP News published an article on January 7, 2022. The title was, "Hospitalizations Skyrocket in Kids Too Young for COVID Shots." The article went on to quote Dr. Rochelle Walensky saying, "This worrisome trend in children too young to be vaccinated underscores the need for older kids and adults to get their shots to help protect those around them." The inference was that if only more adults and teens were vaccinated, we would not have so many young kids in the hospital. However, near the very end of the article, the critical care chief, Dr. John McGuire, was quoted as saying in an email, "Most of the COVID-positive kids in the hospital are actually not here for COVID-19 disease. They are here for other issues, but happen to have tested positive." While I acknowledge that we live in an era where news is about headlines and clicks, integrity is still important. One thing we can say for certain is that the measures taken nationally and locally to mitigate COVID took a significant toll on children and adults alike. CDC data from Texas shows that months with significantly higher rates of suicide-related behaviors appear to correspond to times when COVID-19 responses were heightened. In other words, lockdowns were associated with a 50% increased rate of suicide attempts amongst girls, 94% increase in adolescent overdose mortality, and a tripling of fentanyl overdoses. A CS Mott Children's Hospital poll showed new or worsening anxiety up 36% for girls and 19% for boys, and new or worsening depression up 31% for girls and 18% for boys. 46% of parents noticed new or worsening mental health conditions. We have likely not only scratched the surface of the mental health problems incurred as a result of the community responses to COVID. Myocarditis has become a mainstream term since the appearance of COVID and the vaccines. Scientists have been working hard to try and figure out the cause and the incidence across different age groups. The hardest hit group appears to be young males, and the risk is greatest after multiple injections. The overall risk of teenage males ages 16 to 19 after 2 shots was 9 to 19 times more than would be expected to occur naturally. And at just 30 days after the second shot, the risk of myocarditis in vaccinated teenage males ages 16 to 19 was a full 5 to 18 times greater than the unvaccinated. One argument for vaccination is there's substantial risk of myocarditis from getting COVID itself. However, Patton et al. Found that in younger males receiving a second dose of vaccine, the risk of myocarditis was higher following vaccination and infection, with an additional 101 events estimated following a second dose of vaccine compared to just 7 events following a positive SARS-CoV test. Natural immunity. Natural immunity for viruses, including coronavirus, is an important concept to review and understand. Natural immunity occurs when a person has a viral illness, responds to the illness with the production of immune cells, which will fight off the infection at the time and also keep immune cells with memory for future exposure. When the person gets exposed in the future to the same or similar virus, there's already an army of immune cells that can quickly fight the viral infection. When we get exposed to naturally occurring viruses, we make immune cells with multiple antigenetic components of the virus. Most of us probably can remember that when we had the chickenpox, we were immune and we could never get the disease again. This is a good example of natural immunity. However, respiratory viruses like influenza, rhinovirus, and coronavirus are different. They mutate often, and each season we have the potential to succumb to them. Well, that is unless we have super duper immune systems making sure that our bodies are in a state of homeostasis and that our terrain is well. We need healthy immune systems. We know this. Eat healthy. Rest. Get some sunlight. Exercise. Be with loved ones. Do fun and interesting things. So we should not be surprised that variants and mutations of the coronavirus exist. It is actually expected. This is why vaccines for influenza virus are reformulated every year. And even with that, oftentimes we have coverage issues because of ongoing mutations. This is why some scientists have questioned the role of vaccines in general for respiratory viruses. Additionally, natural immunity to respiratory viruses begins in the nasal passages, which is where our first-line immune cells, or IgA, are produced upon exposure. This first-line production of immune cells does not occur with vaccinations, which are injected intramuscularly. Natural acquired immunity gained after recovering from COVID-19 is robust, complete, and durable. To discount natural immunity is to ignore the principle of vaccination itself, as vaccines seek to mimic exposure to a virus. Natural immunity confers longer-lasting and stronger protection against infection, symptomatic disease, and hospitalization caused by the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2 compared to two-dose vaccine-induced immunity. As of 2021, there are 146 studies that affirm natural acquired immunity to COVID-19 is robust, complete, and durable. As of 2022, there are over 150 studies. Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine professor Dr. Marty Makary stated in a study, "The data on natural immunity are now overwhelming. It turns out that the hypothesis that our public health leaders had that vaccinated immunity is better and stronger than natural immunity was wrong. They got it backwards. And now we've got data from Israel showing that natural immunity is 27 times more effective than vaccinated immunity. Policymakers and public health officials should exercise restraint in mandating vaccination of COVID-19 recovered individuals in light of this information." Traditional vaccines inject dead or attenuated biomaterial, viruses or bacteria, plus other ingredients called adjuvants and excipients to induce an immune response. In this way, when we are exposed to the real thing, our immune system has a head start because we have already seen the threat before. The COVID vaccine is different. This vaccine delivers a set amount of mRNA, messenger RNA, which is taken up by our cells, allowing them to produce copies of the spike protein, a specific protein found on the original Wuhan strain of COVID-19. The main difference between these two modalities is analogous to that of soup and the recipe for soup. A traditional vaccine delivers a set amount of soup for the body to react against. A COVID vaccine gives the body a recipe to make its own soup, and the individual determines how much soup is made and over what period. It might be a lot of soup for several weeks, and it might be very little soup for just a few days. This is one mechanism that might explain the disparity in adverse reactions and efficacy. More soup could mean more adverse reactions. Less soup could mean immunity wears off faster. Finally, we must consider that the mRNA coronavirus vaccine confers a very narrow window of immunity because the vaccine exposes our body to one protein, the spike protein, whereas infection with COVID exposes us to the whole virus. In the latter scenario, we develop antibodies to all sorts of different proteins, not just the spike, which makes immunity more resistant to viral mutation. Omicron has roughly 25 mutations in the spike protein compared to Alpha, which could explain why vaccine immunity is not as durable or robust. This slide is from the Government Accountability Office document that details Operation Warp Speed. Typically, it takes 10 years or so to develop a vaccine and get it to FDA approval and out to the general public. Operation Warp Speed took 10 months. Steps were combined. Time frames were shortened. This dramatically decreased the window to monitor efficacy, as well as short, mid, and long-term adverse reactions. Before emergency use authorization was given to the coronavirus vaccine, the FDA and pharmaceutical companies reviewed the adverse reactions that occurred during the clinical trials. The adverse reactions included Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an ascending progressive paralysis, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, encephalopathy, encephalomyelitis, convulsions, stroke, narcolepsy, anaphylaxis, acute myocardial infarction, myocarditis, autoimmune disease, death, pregnancy and birth-related adverse outcomes, other demyelinating disease, other non-anaphylactic allergic reactions, thrombocytopenia, disseminated intravascular coagulation, venous thromboembolism, arthritis and arthralgias, Kawasaki disease, multisystem inflammatory syndrome, and vaccine-enhanced disease. Monitoring of these adverse reactions after administration to the general public is part of the process for all vaccines and biologics, whether they are FDA approved or emergency use authorized. The mechanism to monitor safety and adverse reactions is through the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, otherwise known as VAERS. Some of the adverse reactions include thrombotic thrombocytopenia, vaccine-induced antibodies attached to a protein involved in blood clotting, spurring platelets to form clots. Another adverse reaction is myocarditis. We spoke about this earlier. Myocarditis decreases heart function. Mortality from myocarditis can be up to 20% at 6.5 years. The spike protein damages the inner walls of blood vessels. Damaged blood vessels lead to inflammation, clots, and strokes as well. The Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, otherwise known as VAERS, has been in place since 1986 when a law was passed removing all product liability from vaccine makers. H.R. 5546, the National Children's Vaccine Injury Act, was passed and needs to be repealed. This established the VAERS database and the Healthcare Compensation Fund that pays for adverse reactions and death from vaccine via the Federal Vaccine Injury Court. VAERS is the government's system for monitoring the safety of vaccines and biologics once they're released to the public. And here we have market interference. They removed product liability, interfered with the free market. The consequences have been dire. Vaccines don't answer to society and market forces. It's the only product that exists without liability responsibility of the producer of the product. VAERS is not perfect. In 2010, the Lazarus report found that only 1 to 10% of adverse reactions are actually reported to the VAERS database. The COVID-19 vaccine has more deaths in 12 months than all other vaccines combined in over 30 years. As of March 11th, 2022, there have been 1,183,493 reports of adverse reactions to VAERS, including 25,641 deaths, 40,000 severe allergic reactions, 36,662 myocarditis, 29,000 life-threatening events, 13,000 heart attacks, 4,335 miscarriages, and more. In 1976, the swine flu vaccine was taken off the market because 500 people had Guillain-Barré syndrome, a progressive ascending paralysis, and 25 people died, which is much less than the VAERS events reported for the COVID-19 vaccine. What is the threshold of adverse events that could constitute a safety signal? Have we not reached that point? Healthcare providers are required by law to report the VAERS. Any adverse event listed in the VAERS table of reportable events following vaccination is considered reportable. Any adverse event listed by the vaccine biologic manufacturer is a relative or absolute contraindication to further vaccination. All manufacturers of vaccines and biologics are required to report to VAERS. Hippocrates once said, primum non scire. This means, first, do no harm. Clearly, there are some red flags with the coronavirus vaccines. Other vaccines that have been taken off the market had fewer adverse reactions and deaths. The recent data shows the vaccines are failing. Reassessment of the analysis of the risk-benefit profile of the coronavirus vaccine needs to occur. Until that happens, until we know the benefits far outweigh the harm or the potential for harm, we must reevaluate the role of the coronavirus vaccine program. Where do we go from here? Public service announcements for strategies to remain healthy. Roundtable discussions with doctors to compare strategies, including doctors on the front lines. Guidance for student safety in schools and institutions. Sharing information to inform healthcare providers and consumers, advising business owners regarding safe business practices, making sure that we provide informed consent. For nearly 2 years, oppressive power exerted by the government used pseudoscience to impose unconstitutional mandates in our country, in my opinion. What is your opinion? Did we live under tyranny? Did you have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Were your rights to body autonomy protected or infringed? Was informed consent obtained for any medical procedure you were given, including the wearing of masks, vaccines, medications, lockdowns, social isolation, COVID testing? Which of the sciences were used to make these decisions? Was the science sound? Biological, economic, logic? Was it constitutional? Which path does humanity want to take? Maybe just a path of learning, understanding, acquiring new information. This slide says, "Bit nicht doren ich verruch die Welt zu retten." Please don't disturb me. I'm trying to save the world. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate your time. Thank you to the amazing people that helped with the DICE component of the presentation, including all the physicians and allied healthcare providers in the DICE organization. And thank you to all my colleagues and friends in Liberty, locally and nationally. I appreciate everyone's help.